Welcome to the Strange Films Podcast, a place for filmmakers, actors, and other creatives.
And it is like a really, really tight knit community. I mean, and now that horror, the indie horror genre really is like taking off. Like Terrifier 2 and like Skinamarink and all these like crazy horror films that are
Even
like
like Barbarian, I mean,
yeah,
that was
Barbarian. Like you hear about all these like really indie, smaller scale productions that Hollywood's not picking up, but they're getting released through A24 or these little studios or smaller scale studios or just self finance and just putting them out on their own, and they're getting huge hits, and like people are loving them and raving about them and wanting more and more and more. Like that is encouraging to me because once again, you're in a community that supports everything you're doing and loves talking about everything. But if you're a horror indie filmmaker or running a show talking about horror films, people are like, yes, like because they want to just be engulfed by everything about it. And so it is a great community to be in. I didn't really fully understand that until just a few years ago, to be honest. And horror films I have a weird relationship with because when I was younger as a kid and really up until like high school, I didn't like horror films. I was terrified of them. I didn't care for them at all and anything. So it wasn't until like high school I started really experimenting with them, and then college I really liked them and started falling in love with them. And now I'm still catching up on classics or indie cult stuff, that I missed out on over the years. So yeah,
well, and even like for you, I know that horror isn't the only thing that you do because you've
yeah,
done some other types of films. But yeah, I definitely think that it the cool thing about horror is that there's so many types of things that fall under that umbrella. You can have like the Silence of the Lambs type of film, which is considered horror, but it's more of a psychological thriller. And then you have the 80s slasher flicks, which are campy, and
hmm
that's a whole other level. And then you have Saw, the really violent sort of torture type films that would be considered horror. So I think I like that in the horror world everybody can find their niche.
hmm
It's not just one type of thing, and so yeah, it's a great community. And I have found, I started watching horror films as a kid. My dad and I used to watch the Friday the 13th together. Specifically, he thought Jason was funny. My dad had a really morbid sense of humor. He laughed at him and thought he was hilarious because I mean, those films, they're so fun. To me, it's because now, all these years later, a lot of it's so unrealistic that it's just funny, some of it, But I'll tell you my favorite, and I think this is one of your favorites too when we talked in our last interview. The film that really just and the filmmaker that really got me on a path of even loving horror as a young kid was John Carpenter.
hmm
And the original Halloween
hmm
is I have a poster over here. Well, we're on a podcast, but I have one of the original movie posters that my aunt found in California, like way back in the 80s, that
wow.
was on display when it was in the theaters. And I have that on my wall because I absolutely love that film. And I think John Carpenter is just a genius. He did a lot of things in that film, like the steady cam and things that had not been done before. And he composed the theme, which it's iconic. You hear the first few bars of that song and everybody knows that's Halloween. That the music to that film is a character in itself. So when connecting him and how he wrote it, produced it with Deborah Hill and the music, that just sparked my love for horror even more. And then he's done so many other things after that, like The Fog and They Live and The Thing, and so many films that I feel are so important in the landscape of horror. And he really ushered in the late 70s and 78 when Halloween came out. He was the one that ushered in all of the slashers of the 80s because everybody started imitating him. I mean, Friday
hmm
the 13th, and I love Friday the 13th. Even the filmmakers say it's a direct, imitation or ripoff of Halloween. And so, those types of films, they have such a nostalgia for me because I also think of it as watching with my dad, and he has since passed, but I think a lot of people connect to certain things in their lives, whether it be music or movies. And for me, it's horror that, they remember as a kid, and that it had a special meaning beyond just it was a slasher flick,
Yeah.
and so those films to me are very important in my life. I love them. I love the creativity behind it. I love that, especially John Carpenter, and this is the same with you, that he was able to do so much with such a limited budget for that first Halloween, but he created such a masterpiece with nothing, which shows you that you don't need all the bells and whistles to create a great film. And people probably don't remember this who haven't watched it lately, but the original Halloween hardly had any blood in it. It
No.
wasn't a blood and guts picture. It was the thought that someone would just randomly target these people and kill them for apparently no reason. So the idea because that has happened in real life, and then that could really happen, and there'd be no reason beyond that he's just an evil force, that to me is horrific. So you didn't need the blood and the guts. Now, of course, as it moved on, Halloween has become a more of a blood and guts type of franchise. But those are the things that I think of, when I think of loving horror movies growing up. It's that connection that I had with films like that.